Chapter 15. The Winding Down. Erik Lehnsherr had been alive for more than a century. He had survived Auschwitz. He had survived the loss of his wife, his daughter, his students, his friends. He had survived the constant war between his vision and Charles's, the decades of failure and the single, cataclysmic victory that had given him everything he wanted. He had survived the fire that had scarred half his face and taken the sight from his left eye, had survived it, healed from it, adapted to a body that no longer worked the way it had before. But he had not survived time. The signs had been subtle at first, a tremor in his right hand that he dismissed as stress, a moment of dizziness he attributed to poor sleep, a sensation, growing more frequent, that the magnetic fields he manipulated were somehow heavier than they had been. As if the effort required to move them had doubled overnight and he simply hadn't noticed the increase. Then came the pain. It started in his back, a deep, grinding ache that settled between his vertebrae like a living thing, making itself comfortable, refusing to leave. Then it spread to his joints, his shoulders, his hips, the places where bone met bone and the body's architecture bore its weight. The pain was not constant. It came in waves and flares in the moments when his body reminded him that it was not built for the forces he asked it to channel. Erik ignored it. He had ignored worse. Pain was a language he had spoken since childhood, since the camps, since the days when he had learned that the body could endure anything if the mind demanded it. He pushed through the pain and continued his work, but the work was changing. He had always been a revolutionary, a man who acted, who moved, who built momentum and drove toward the next goal. Now he found himself spending more time in the study, more time in conversation with his counsel, more time considering the structure of what he had built rather than its direction. He was thinking about succession, about what came after. This was new. This was terrifying. He had never thought about after. After was for people who lost. After was for people who gave up. Erik Lehnsherr did not give up. He had spent his entire life refusing to give up, treating every setback as a temporary inconvenience and every defeat as fuel for the next assault. The idea that there might come a point where he was too tired, too damaged, too old to continue, that idea had never occurred to him because he had never needed it to. Now he needed it. The tremor in his right hand had spread to his left. The pain in his back had become a constant companion. His vision, his good eye, the one the fire hadn't taken, began to blur at the edges as if the world itself was slowly dimming. He was dying. Not quickly, not dramatically, but inevitably, the way all mortal things died, one cell at a time, one thought at a time, one day at a time. And he refused. Chapter 16. The Weight of Legacy. Mystique found him in the study late at night, standing at the window where he always stood. She had learned to read him over decades, not through the face he showed the world, but through the tells that only she could see. The way he held his shoulders when he was thinking, the way his hands hung when he was tired, the way he looked at the city when he was afraid and didn't want anyone to know. Tonight he was afraid. "The council is concerned," she said, not an accusation, an observation. She walked to the chair that was always available for her, sat down with the easy grace that belied her ability to become anything. "Your absence at yesterday's session, the reports from your personal physicians that you've been ignoring. The physicians are alarmists. The physicians are correct. You're not invincible, Erik. Even you have limits." He turned from the window. Scar tissue on the left side of his face caught the light, the permanent mark that the human torch had left on him, the scar that would never fully heal no matter how much time passed. It was a reminder, a lesson, a demonstration of the truth that he had always known and had allowed himself briefly to forget. Nothing was permanent, not even him. "I need to build something," he said. "Something that lasts, not just laws and institutions, something deeper, something that survives me." "You're talking about legacy. I'm talking about necessity. The world I've built depends on me, not the structures, the dependence, the belief that I am necessary, that without me everything falls apart." He paused. "And they're right, they are right. I am necessary. The moment I become unnecessary, the moment the world decides it can survive without me." "Then what?" Erik was quiet for a long moment. The question was one he had been asking himself for months, the question that had kept him awake at night, that had driven him to the study window more often than he would admit, that had slowly, patiently become the only question that mattered. "Then everything I've built becomes a monument to a man who thought he was necessary and wasn't. The mutants I've protected learned to live without protection. The humans I've controlled learned to live without control. And the world moves on, not because I gave it the tools to move, but because I was gone and there was no one left to stop it from changing. That's not necessarily a bad thing." "No, but it's not what I want." Erik's voice was harder now, the voice of a man who knew what he wanted and was struggling to find a way to get it. "I want to build something that continues, something that carries my vision forward even when I'm not there to defend it. Not a replacement, a legacy. a piece of me that survives in the structure itself, in the laws and the systems and the beliefs that hold the world together. Mystique studied him. She had known Erik for decades, had seen him at his best and his worst, had watched him become the thing he had always been becoming. She knew better than anyone that Erik Lehnsherr did not think about legacy unless he was thinking about death. "You're dying," she said. "Not dying, winding down. Same thing, different words." "No," Erik turned back to the window. "Dying is passive, it happens to you. Winding down is something else, something I can control, something I can use." Use for what? The question hung in the air. Erik watched the city, his world, the thing he had built with his hands and his will and the accumulated trauma of a century spent refusing to let the world break him. "I'm going to find a way to extend it," he said quietly. "Not immortality, I'm not that foolish, but enough. Enough time to build what needs to be built. Enough strength to finish what I started. Enough will to see this through." "Can't find it. Then I'll build something else, something that works without me." He paused. The words were harder than he expected, harder even than the admission of mortality, harder than the acknowledgement of limits. "Something that proves I was more than just a man who refused to lose." Mystique was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was different, softer, almost human. "You know what happens to men who try to make themselves necessary forever, Erik? You studied them. You learned from them. You built your entire philosophy on the understanding that no one man should have that much power for that long. I know. And you're going to do it anyway. I'm going to do what's necessary." Erik turned to face her. The scar tissue pulled at his expression, the face that had once been handsome that was now something harder to define. "That's what I've always done. That's what I'll always do. The difference is that now I know exactly what it costs." He walked to the door, paused. Did not look back. "Good night, Raven. I'll see you at the council session tomorrow." He left. Mystique sat in the study that had once been Charles's and thought about the men she had known who tried to make themselves eternal. Most of them had not ended well. Chapter 17. The Stone. The Infinity Stones were not a subject Erik Lehnsherr had ever studied in depth. They were cosmic artifacts, objects of power that belonged in theories and legends, not in the practical business of running a world. He had encountered them peripherally over the decades, had heard rumors of their capabilities, had dismissed them as irrelevant to his work. But a dying man reconsidered many things. The Soul Stone was the most enigmatic of the six. Where the other stones could be understood through analogy, the Time Stone bent chronology, the Space Stone collapsed distance, the Power Stone amplified force, the Soul Stone's nature was harder to grasp. It touched something fundamental, something that science and magic both struggled to name. The self, the essence, the thing that made a being rather than a collection of molecules performing electrochemical functions. Erik became obsessed with it. He had resources that no one else had, not just the wealth and power of a global empire, but the accumulated intelligence of a mind that had spent a century studying the intersection of mutation, technology, and mysticism. He had contacts in dimensions he had never visited, alliances with beings who owed him favors and feared his capabilities. And he had the kind of single-minded determination that came from knowing you had nothing left to lose. The search took 2 years. It ended on a world Erik barely remembered, a small planet in a system he had conquered decades earlier, colonized and forgotten, its population long since integrated into Magneto's empire. But beneath the surface of that planet, in a vault that predated human civilization, the Soul Stone waited. Erik retrieved it personally. He told no one, not Mystique, not his council, not the advisors who had guided his reign for years. He told no one because he knew, with the certainty that had kept him alive through the Holocaust and the wars that followed, that no one would understand. They would call it vanity. They would call it desperation. They would say that Erik Lehnsherr had finally lost the thread that separated him from the tyrants he had always hated. They would be right. But Erik had spent a century being right when everyone else was wrong, and he had learned that being right and being alone were often the same thing. Chapter 18. The Bounding. Soul Stone was smaller than Erik expected. A gem the size of a grape, warm to the touch, pulsing with a faint light that seemed to come from inside rather than from the surface. It felt like a heartbeat. Erik held it in his damaged hand, the hand that had once commanded the electromagnetic spectrum itself, that had bent metal and matter to his will with the casual effort of breathing, and now trembled with a weakness he could not explain or overcome. "You know what I want," he said to the stone. He was alone in the study. The house was empty. The council was elsewhere. The world was sleeping. The stone pulsed, not an answer, a recognition. "I want to live not as I have been living, not this slow decay, this steady surrender. I want to live, to build, to leave something behind that matters." The light intensified. The warmth spread up his arm. "I know what the stories say. I know the price. But the price assumes I have something left to lose. I don't." I have nothing except the world I built, and it will fall apart without me, the way all things fall apart without someone to hold them together." He paused. The stone pulsed in his hand, synchronized with his own heartbeat. "I am not asking for immortality, I am asking for enough. Enough time to build what needs to be built. Enough strength to finish what I started. Enough will to see this through." The stone pulsed. And Erik, he pressed it to his chest. The bonding was not painful. It was everything painful. Every loss he had ever experienced compressed into a single instant, and then released, not as relief but as transformation. He felt the stone enter him the way water enters cracked earth, filling the spaces he hadn't known were empty, flowing into channels he hadn't known existed. And with the stone came the voices. Millions of them. Billions. Every soul the stone had ever touched, every consciousness it had absorbed or sheltered or simply witnessed since the beginning of time. They were not intrusive, more like a choir heard through a wall, present but not demanding. They were there. They would always be there. And they carried with them the accumulated weight of existence itself. Love, loss, joy, grief, the full spectrum of what it meant to be alive and to eventually stop being so. Erik Lehnsherr, the boy from Auschwitz, the survivor, the revolutionary, the tyrant, the savior, he felt them all at once. And in feeling them, he understood something he had never understood in all his decades of power. He was not special. He was not uniquely burdened or uniquely chosen. He was one consciousness among billions, one heartbeat in a rhythm that had been beating since before stars existed and would continue beating long after stars died. His pain was not singular. His cause was not singular. His victory and his villainy and his everything, all of it was just one note in a symphony so vast that the concept of a single note barely made sense. And yet the note mattered. The note was his, and as long as the note existed, the symphony could not be complete without it. Erik opened his eyes. The world looked the same. The study, the window, the city beyond. But Erik's eyes, his single functional eye, saw deeper than they ever had. He could see the souls around him. The guards outside his palace, the citizens in the streets, the council members in their homes. Not their thoughts, not their secrets, but their essences, the irreducible core of who they were, the thing that would remain when everything else about them was stripped away. And he could feel, for the first time in years, the certainty that had driven him since the Holocaust. Not the certainty that he was right, he had lost that, or found a more complicated version of it. But the certainty that he would act. That whatever came next, he would face it the way he had faced everything, directly, without flinching, with every resource he possessed. The soul stone settled into him like a second heartbeat, and Erik Lehnsherr, empowered, eternal, terrified, and more alone than ever, got up from his chair and returned to work. Chapter 19. The Sovereignty of Self. The effects of the bonding became visible within months. Erik no longer aged, or rather, he aged selectively, allowing the parts of him that needed repair to repair while maintaining the strength and clarity of his mind. The tremor in his hand stopped. The pain in his back faded. His vision stabilized, and the blurred edges of the world sharpened into the same crystalline focus he had enjoyed in his prime. But something else changed, too. Something that could not be measured in medical scans or quantified in council reports. Erik became absolute, not in the sense of being tyrannical, though his rule had always been autocratic. He became absolute in the sense of being complete. A man who had spent a century divided against himself, pulled between hope and fear, between Charles's dream and his own nightmare, now possessed a unity of purpose that was almost alien in its perfection. The arguments inside his head had gone silent. The doubts had been absorbed by the stone, or dissolved by it, or simply made irrelevant by the vastness of what he now knew. He could feel the souls of every being on Earth, not their thoughts, but their weight. The collective mass of human and mutant consciousness pressing against his awareness like an ocean against a cliff. And he understood, with a clarity that terrified him, that he could influence that ocean. Not through control, not through command, but through something more fundamental, the same way a stone in a river directed the flow of water without commanding it. He was becoming something new. Something that was still Erik Lehnsherr, still the boy from Auschwitz, still the man who had lost everything and rebuilt it and lost it again, but something that was also more than that. Something that the soul stone had opened up, like a door into a room Erik hadn't known existed in his own mind. He built. He planned. He designed systems of governance that would function without his constant supervision, not because he intended to step back, but because he understood, for the first time, that stepping back was not the same as letting go. A king who built a kingdom that survived him was not a king who had failed. He was a king who had succeeded in the only way that mattered. But underneath the building, underneath the planning, the old fear still lived. The fear that had driven him since the camps, the fear that had shaped every decision and every compromise, the fear of being alone. The soul stone amplified that fear even as it gave him the power to act on it, because the stone showed him, every day, every moment, the vastness of the consciousness it contained, and the corresponding smallness of his own. He was one voice in a choir of billions. And no amount of power could change that fundamental truth. He could only add his voice to the chorus and hope it was heard. The council noticed the change, but they did not understand it. Erik moved differently now, with more certainty, less hesitation, the movements of a man who had seen something no one else had seen and could not describe it in terms that would make sense. He attended sessions, gave orders, made decisions. But there was a distance in his eyes that had not been there before, a sense that he was looking at the council from somewhere else, somewhere far away, somewhere that only he could reach. Mystique tried to talk to him about it more than once, more than twice. She came to the study at night and found him at the window, always at the window, watching the city with an expression she could not read. "You're different," she said on one of those nights. "Since, whatever happened, whatever you did, I'm the same." "No, you're not." She stood beside him, looked out at the same view he was looking at. "You've always been present, too present sometimes. You felt everything, now you feel nothing. Or everything at once, I can't tell which." Erik was quiet for a moment. The stone hummed in his chest. The voices sang softly, always softly, a constant background that he had learned to filter but could never fully silence. "I'm building something," he said. "Something that lasts, that's what I told you. That's what I'm doing. You're building something, or you are becoming something, I can't tell which. Maybe both." He turned to look at her. The scar tissue on his face caught the light, the permanent mark, the reminder of the fire that had nearly killed him. "Does it matter?" "Of course it matters. You're, what, changing, adapting, becoming something you don't recognize." He shook his head slowly. "I'm doing what I've always done, Raven. I'm surviving, I'm building. I'm making sure that when I'm gone, the world remembers what I wanted it to become." "You're not going to be gone. You made sure of that." "No, I made sure I have time. There's a difference." He turned back to the window. "The stone gives me enough. Not forever, nothing is forever, but enough. Enough to finish what I started, enough to build the legacy I need to leave." "And then?" The question hung in the air. Erik watched the city, his world, the thing he had built and was still building, would keep building until there was nothing left of him to build with. "Then we'll see," he said. "Then we'll see what comes next." Mystique left. Erik stayed at the window. The voices sang. The city glittered. The night pressed against the glass, patient and vast and indifferent to the concerns of men who thought they could reshape the world according to their will. Erik Lehnsherr stood at the window of the study that had been Charles's, and he felt for the first time in years that he was exactly where he needed to be, not because he had won, not because he had survived, not because he had become what he always wanted to become. Because he had finally accepted that the winning and the surviving and the becoming were all the same thing, and none of them were the point. And the point was something he could feel but not name. Something that lived in the space between the voices in his head and the light from the stone in his chest, and the city that sprawled beyond the window like a promise he had made to himself and everyone who came before him. The point was legacy. The point was time. The point was the ember that burned in the hearts of people who refused to accept the world as it was and kept working, kept waiting, kept believing that someday it would change. Magneto could feel them, the remnant, the resistance, the quiet network of people who were building something he did not understand and could not control. He could feel their faith, their patience, their refusal to give up. He had always been able to feel them, but now the feeling was sharper, clearer, a constant presence at the edge of his awareness. He did not fear them. He had never feared them. Fear was for people who did not understand what they were up against, and Erik Lehnsherr understood everything. But he watched them. He watched them the way a farmer watches weather, not with fear, but with the knowledge that someday, somehow, the storm would come, and he would need to be ready. The ember would catch eventually. And when it did, Erik would be waiting. Chapter 20. Victor Von Doom. The message arrived in Magneto's palace through channels he did not recognize and could not trace. A handwritten letter on paper so old it predated the nation that would become Latveria. The handwriting was precise, regal. The handwriting of a man who had spent decades refining not just his craft but his bearing, who had made even the act of writing into a performance of absolute authority. Erik Lehnsherr, I have watched your ascension with interest and your reign with patience. Both have exceeded my expectations, though not in the ways you might hope. I come to you now not as a supplicant or a competitor, but as an equal, one sovereign to another. Your empire and mine have coexisted in a state of mutual tolerance for decades, each recognizing the other's domain, each profiting from the other's strength. This arrangement has served us well, but circumstances have changed. Your bond with the Soul Stone has not gone unnoticed. The energy signature you radiate is visible to any sufficiently advanced being within 3 planetary systems. I am not the only one who has noticed, and I am not the only one who is concerned. I come to discuss what comes next, for you, for your empire, for the world you have built on the foundations of fear and power. I will arrive in 3 days. I suggest you be ready. Victor Von Doom. Erik read the letter twice. Then he set it on his desk, stood and walked to the window. The city glittered. his city, his world. The lights of a civilization that had been built on his vision, maintained by his will, held together by his hands, hands that now held the soul stone and everything that implied. Victor von Doom, the ruler of Latveria, the most brilliant mind of his generation, surpassed only by Reed Richards, and even that claim was debatable. A man who had built a kingdom in his own image, who had made himself a god in a small country and then set his sights on something larger, who had spent his entire adult life pursuing power with the kind of focus that Erik recognized because he had pursued it himself. Doom was not his enemy, not exactly. They had been allies on occasion, enemies on others, and more often than not something that belonged in neither category, a kind of professional respect between two men who understood what it meant to hold the world in your hands and shape it according to your will. But Doom was also dangerous in ways Erik was only beginning to understand, because Doom had watched him bond with the Soul Stone. Doom had calculated. And Doom had decided, for reasons Erik could not yet determine, that the time had come to have a conversation. 3 days. Erik pressed his palm against the window. The glass was cold. His reflection stared back, unchanged, unaged, utterly in control. But the reflection couldn't see the stone pulsing beneath his chest, couldn't feel the billions of voices humming just below the surface of every thought. Doom would understand those things. Doom would understand them and know what they meant and have an opinion about them that Erik would have to either accept or reject. 3 days. Erik turned away from the window and began to prepare. Meanwhile, in the tunnels beneath the city, Ramai moved through the darkness like a man who had been born in it. The tunnels were old, older than Magneto's empire, older than the nation that had existed before Magneto's empire, old enough that their original purpose had been forgotten, and their current purpose had become something else entirely. They ran beneath the Genoshan capital like veins beneath skin, connecting spaces that were not supposed to be connected, providing paths that were not supposed to exist. The Remnant had been mapping them for 2 years. 7 people waited in the chamber at the tunnel's end, 7 cell leaders, the inner circle, the ones who knew what was being planned and why. They had come through different routes, different tunnels, taking different paths to ensure that no single route could be traced to all of them. They had done this before, many times in different safe houses in different cities. But this time was different. This time, they were not meeting to discuss intelligence or strategy or the patient work of building an ember that might never catch. This time, they were meeting to plan a fire. Ramai reached the chamber, took his place at the center of the circle, nodded to the faces around him, the faces of people he had come to know over 5 years of work, people he trusted, people who believed in what they were doing with the same uncomplicated faith that had brought him to this moment. "We start in 2 weeks," he said. "The intelligence has been confirmed. The resources are in position, the people are ready." The room was silent. They had heard this before, or versions of it, the slow accumulation of readiness, the patient preparation for something that had been years in the making. But something in Ramai's voice was different now. Something in the way he held himself, the way he looked at them, the way the words came out with a weight that went beyond planning. "This is not a raid," Ramai continued. "Not a demonstration. Not a strike on some target that proves Magneto's not invincible. This is more." He paused. The silence stretched. "Too much more to tell you about yet. But I need you to understand. When the time comes, you're gonna have to trust me. Not just wit your lives, wit your futures. Wit everything you've been building. You're gonna have to be willing to give it all up if I ask you to, and you're gonna have to believe that I won't ask unless it's necessary." Kurt Wagner was not in the room. Kurt was gone, had been gone since the betrayal, since the trap, since Ramai had walked out of the corridor with the letter burning in his chest and the truth burning in his mind. But if Kurt had been there, Ramai thought, he would have seen the faith in the faces around the circle. The same faith that had carried them through years of waiting. The same faith that would carry them through whatever came next. 2 weeks, Ramai said again. "Be ready." They nodded. They understood. They dispersed into the darkness the way they had come, through different routes, different paths, carrying the weight of what they had heard and what they did not yet know. Ramai stayed in the chamber for a long time after they were gone. The fire was coming. He could feel it the same way he had always felt the ember, the patience, the slow accumulation of something that would eventually catch. But this was different. This was not the quiet burn of years of work. This was something larger, something that would change everything if it succeeded and destroy everything if it failed. He did not know which would happen, but he knew, as he had always known, that the only way to find out was to let it burn. Chapter 21. The Arrival. Victor von Doom arrived in Genosha at dawn. He did not arrive by force. He did not need to. He arrived in a convoy of official vehicles bearing the crest of Latveria, a stylized mask with horns, the symbol of a kingdom that had been ruled by a single man for longer than most nations had existed. The convoy crossed the border without resistance, because Magneto's enforcers had been ordered to allow it, and because the border itself was a technicality that Doom's technology rendered meaningless. Erik met him in the same courtyard where Charles Xavier had died years ago. He stood on the same flagstones in the same position, wearing the same expression of controlled power that he had worn that day. History did not repeat exactly, but it rhymed, and Erik had learned to appreciate the rhythm. The convoy stopped. The doors of the lead vehicle opened. Doom stepped out. He was taller than Erik remembered, not physically, but in the way he carried himself, as if the air around him had been compressed to accommodate his presence. The mask was gone, as it always was in private meetings between sovereigns. Doom's face was exposed, and the scars that latticed his features caught the morning light like the surface of a planet seen from orbit. Erik had seen that face before. He had seen it in victory and defeat, in alliance and conflict, in moments when both men had been sure they were about to destroy each other. He had never seen it quite like this. Calm, patient, certain. Erik, Doom said. His voice was the same resonant baritone that had argued for mutant-human cooperation at the UN negotiated treaties with the Vatican, and once delivered a 40-minute speech on the ethical responsibilities of technological power that had made several world leaders weep. Victor, they stood in silence for a moment. Around them, the courtyard held its breath, not the breath of fear exactly, but the breath of recognition. Two men who had built empires, who had sacrificed everything for their visions, who had become something more than human in the pursuit of those visions, standing face to face in the place where one of them had killed his oldest friend. "You've changed," Doom said. It was not a question. "The stone changes everyone. I can see it, the energy signature, you're radiant, Erik, literally, you glow with the light of a billion souls." He tilted his head, a curious gesture, almost academic. "Does it hurt? Yes. Does it help? Yes." Doom nodded slowly. He walked to the center of the courtyard, his cloak trailing behind him, and stopped at the exact spot where Charles Xavier had fallen. "You know why I'm here?" "Not entirely. I know you're concerned about the stone. I know you've calculated the implications, but I don't know what you want." Doom turned to face him. In the morning light, his scars looked almost like a map, geography written in flesh, territories of pain mapped across a face that had once been handsome and was now something more interesting. "What I want," Doom said, "is to understand what you intend." They sat across from each other in Erik's study, the room that had been Charles's, that had been Magneto's, that was now something that belonged to neither of them and both. Doom had declined the chair Erik offered. He preferred to stand, to move, to pace the way he did when he was thinking through a problem. Erik did not take offense. He understood the compulsion, the need to move when the mind was working faster than the body could comfortably accommodate. "The Soul Stone is not an amplification device," Doom began. His voice had shifted, less diplomatic, more academic, the voice of a scholar addressing a subject he had studied for decades. "It is not a tool for increasing your personal power or extending your lifespan, though it has those effects. It is a gateway, a connection to a layer of reality that exists beneath the physical universe, beneath time, beneath space, beneath the fundamental forces that govern matter and energy." "I know. You know the mechanism. I'm asking if you know the implications." Erik was quiet for a moment. The stone pulsed beneath his chest. The voices hummed, billions of them, billions of minds, the accumulated weight of existence pressing against his awareness like a tide. "I know that I am connected to something vast," he said slowly. "I know that the connection is permanent, and I know that the stone has given me capabilities I do not fully understand and may never fully understand. And yet you use it. I use everything I have. That's who I am." Doom stopped pacing. He stood at the window, Erik's window, the window Erik looked through every morning to see the world he had built, and stared out at the city. "I have studied the Infinity Stones for 30 years, he said. "I have built devices that can interface with their energy signatures. I have mapped their quantum signatures and traced their movements through time. And I have concluded, through calculation and observation, and a lifetime of pursuing knowledge that others called impossible, that the stones are not objects. They are conditions, states of being that the universe adopted at the moment of its creation and has maintained ever since." Erik listened. The stone pulsed. "When you bond with a stone," Doom continued, "you are not adding a tool to your arsenal. You are changing your fundamental nature. You are becoming something that was never meant to exist in the form of a single consciousness, a gate standing in the shape of a man. Is that a warning? It is an observation. Whether you take it as a warning depends on what you intend. And what do you believe I intend?" Doom turned from the window. His eyes, the only part of his face that the scars hadn't touched, clear and dark and almost impossibly intelligent, fixed on Erik with an intensity that felt physical. "I believe you intend to make your empire permanent. To use the stone to extend your influence not just across this world but across dimensions, across time, across every barrier that has ever separated one form of consciousness from another." I believe you intend to become not just the ruler of this planet but the architect of a sovereign consciousness that spans existence itself. Erik did not answer. The stone pulsed. And I believe, Doom said, that you are wrong. Chapter 22. The Argument. The stone does not give you permanence, Doom continued. It gives you connection, and connection is not the same as stability, it is the opposite. Every consciousness it has ever touched is still with you, still pressing against your awareness, still influencing your thoughts in ways you cannot perceive because the influence has become indistinguishable from your own nature. I'm aware of this. Are you? Then tell me, Erik, do you still think in straight lines? Your thoughts still move from one point to another with the clarity and purpose that defined your mind for a century? Or do they spiral, repeat, branch and rebranch in patterns you don't recognize as your own? Erik was silent. The stone pulsed. The answer is the second, Doom said, not cruelly, clinically. I have watched the change in you. The way you speak has altered, the rhythm of your decisions, the textures of your arguments. You are still Erik Lehnsherr, but you are also something else, a composite consciousness that contains your mind and the accumulated echoes of every mind the stone has ever touched. And that composite is not stable. It cannot be stable. The voices will continue to accumulate, the connections will continue to deepen, and eventually, perhaps in a decade, perhaps in a century, Erik Lehnsherr will be nothing more than a flavor in a vast ocean of consciousness. A single note absorbed into a chord. Ripple absorbed into a wave. That is not what I want. Then you should not have bonded with the stone, but you did, and now we are here, and the question is not what you wanted but what you will do. Erik stood. The conversation had shifted, no longer a debate between equals but something more urgent, more personal. Doom had identified the thing Erik feared most and named it with the precision of a surgeon. I have built an empire, Erik said. A world. A system that protects mutants and maintains order and prevents the return of the persecution that defined my childhood. That system requires leadership. It requires continuity. It requires me. It requires someone, not necessarily you. Who could replace me? Who has the vision, the power, the history to hold this together the way I have held it? Doom's expression did not change. You have been asking that question for years, Erik. You have been building systems of governance, cultivating successors, designing institutions that can function without your direct involvement. You have done this not because you trust others, but because you know, in the part of yourself that still thinks clearly, that you will not always be here to hold the pieces together. The stone will not save you from yourself. The stone will not give you a successor. The stone will not ensure that the world you built survives your transformation into something that is no longer Erik Lehnsherr. It will only give you more time that you will spend losing yourself, one thought at a time, one connection at a time, until the man who ruled the world is as much a ghost as the boy who survived the camps. The silence that followed was absolute. Meanwhile, in the tunnels beneath the city, the cell leaders had returned to their positions. The network was moving, not visibly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way that networks move when they are preparing for something that cannot be prepared for in any ordinary sense. Information was flowing. Resources were being positioned. People were being placed in locations that would matter when the time came. Myra sat at her workstation, her fingers moving across the interface with the easy fluency of someone who had spent years learning to read data the way others read faces. The intelligence she was processing was not the intelligence of Magneto's movements or enforcer patrols or council decisions. It was something else, something that had been accumulating for months, pieces of a picture that she could see forming but could not yet see complete. The pattern was not political, not military, not any of the categories that the remnant usually tracked. It was structural. She did not know what it meant. She had reported her findings to Ramai, and Ramai had told her to keep tracking, keep watching, keep building the picture. He knew what it meant, or believed he knew, or was willing to believe until the moment when believing or not believing no longer mattered. She wondered sometimes whether she should be afraid, whether the thing they were planning was too large, too risky, too likely to destroy everything they had built. He had been with the remnant for 3 years, had watched it grow from a handful of cells to a network that spanned continents, had believed in its philosophy of patience and its rejection of dramatic action. But patience had its limits, and some fires could not be managed with patience alone. She kept tracking. The pattern grew clearer with every data point, every movement, every piece of the structure that was being assembled in places she could not name and did not need to name. The fire was coming. She could feel it the way Ramai felt it, the way all of them felt it, the ember that had been burning for years and was finally ready to catch. Chapter 23. The Choice. Erik stood at the window. Doom stood behind him. The morning light had become midday light, and the city glittered with the same indifferent beauty it had displayed for years. Why are you telling me this? Erik asked, not defensively, genuinely curious. Doom had come to Genosha with a purpose, and Erik had not yet determined what it was. Because I have built something as well, Doom said. Not an empire of fear and power, I have something different. Something that I will not describe because description would reduce it to something it is not. But I have built it, and I have maintained it, and I have learned things in the process of building and maintaining it that I believe you need to hear. And what are those things? That the worst thing a ruler can do is confuse his own survival with the survival of his creation. That an empire which cannot exist without a single man is not an empire, it is a monument to that man's ego. And that the only legacy worth building is one that continues after you are no longer capable of caring whether it continues. Erik turned from the window. He looked at Doom, really looked, with the clarity the stone had given him, and the memory of everything he had lost, and the knowledge of everything he had built. You came here to tell me I'm dying. I came here to tell you that you are already dead, Erik. The question is whether your empire will die with you or learn to live without you. And I came to offer you a choice about how that happens. Doom spoke for a long time. His words were precise, measured, the words of a man who had rehearsed this conversation in his mind 1,000 times and found exactly the right way to say what needed to be said. The choice was this. Erik could continue on his current path, using the stone, deepening the bond, allowing his consciousness to be absorbed into the vast ocean of souls it connected him to. This path would give him power beyond imagination, the ability to shape reality and time and existence itself. It would also, inevitably, erase Erik Lehnsherr as a distinct entity, not kill him, nothing so clean. He would simply become something else, something that wore his memories and used his power but was no longer him in any way that mattered. Or Erik could do something else. Something Doom had been developing for years in secret for precisely this kind of moment. A procedure, a technology, a philosophy, something that occupied the space between all three that could extract the stone from a bonded host without destroying the host. It was not without cost. Cost was significant, but it was survivable. If you choose the extraction, Doom said, you will lose the power you have gained. You will return to being what you were before you bonded, still one of the most powerful mutants on Earth, still the ruler of an empire, but mortal, fallible, limited. And the stone will need a new home. I have built a vessel for it, a containment system that will allow the stone's power to be accessed without a living host. The stone will go there. It will not bond with another consciousness, not through the vessel I have built. Why? Erik asked. Why would you do this? What do you gain? Doom was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, softer, almost human. Because I knew Charles Xavier. Not well, not as you knew him, but well enough to understand what he saw in you and what you saw in him. And I have spent decades watching you, watching your rise, your victories, your compromises, your losses. I have watched you become the thing you feared, and I have watched you justify it with a conviction that I recognize because I have felt it myself. You feel it now. I feel it now. And I am telling you as a man who has stood where you stand and looked down and seen what you are about to become. Stop. Erik stared at him. The stone pulsed beneath his chest. If you continue, Doom said, you will lose yourself. Not in the way you fear, not the slow erosion of age and weakness, but in a different way. A deeper way. The stone will absorb you, and the empire you built will become something that serves the stone's nature rather than your original purpose. It will stop being a protection for mutants and become a tool for something else, something the stone defines, not you. And if I accept your extraction, then you will live as Erik Lehnsherr, with the knowledge you have gained and the power you always had, and you will face the question every ruler eventually faces. What do you build when you can no longer build with power? What do you create when the forces that made you have been removed? Erik closed his eyes. He thought of Charles's letter, the letter Ramai had read and burned, the letter that contained the question Charles had never been able to ask him in life. What would Erik do with the piece he forced into existence? Would he be the protector or the tyrant? He thought of Johnny Storm, burning himself to nothing to leave a scar on Erik's face that would never fully heal. He thought of Kurt Wagner, believing in what he had built with the same uncomplicated faith that Erik had once brought to his own vision. He thought of the remnant, the network Ramai had built, the resistance that refused to die, the ember that had been burning for years and might someday catch. He thought of the billions of souls humming beneath his own thoughts, pressing against his awareness, waiting to be joined by one more voice that would add to their chorus and be absorbed into their song. And he opened his eyes. Chapter 24, The Waiting. Doom waited. He stood in the study, his cloak draped across his shoulders, his face unreadable behind the lattice of scars that told the story of a man who had learned to build himself from the ruins of his own ambition. He had made his offer. He had said what needed to be said. Now he waited, not impatiently, not anxiously, but with the patience of a man who understood that the most important decisions were the ones that could not be rushed. Erik stood at the window. His reflection stared back at him, unchanged, unaged, the face of a man who had survived everything except the thing he had been trying to escape since childhood. The scar tissue on his left side caught the light. The stone pulsed in his chest. The voices sang their endless song. The question Doom had asked hung in the air. What would Erik do when he could no longer build with power? What would he create when the forces that made him had been removed? He did not know. That was the thing. That was the thing he had been avoiding for years, the thing he had tried to solve with the Soul Stone and the legacy building and the endless, exhausting work of holding an empire together. He did not know who he was if he was not the man who fought, the man who built, the man who refused to let the world break him the way it had broken him once before. The stone had promised him more time, but more time was not an answer. More time was just more of the same, more building, more fighting, more holding together of a structure that would eventually fall apart no matter how hard he held. Doom's offer was different. Doom's offer was a way out, not a way out of power, but a way out of the trap of believing that his survival was the same as his purpose, the trap of confusing his own life with the lives of everyone who depended on him. The trap that had kept him running for a century and had never, not once, let him stop and ask whether the running was worth it. "Tell me about the extraction," Erik said quietly. Doom nodded slowly. "The procedure requires preparation, weeks of work, specialized equipment, the coordination of resources that I have spent years assembling. It is not something that can be done on a whim, but if you choose to pursue it, I can begin the preparations immediately." "And the cost?" "The cost is what I said. You lose the power the stone has given you. Not all of it. The stone's influence will remain to some degree for the rest of your life. But the connection, the gateway, the ability to access the consciousness it represents, those will be severed. You will return to being what you were. A mutant, a ruler. A man who survived the Holocaust and built an empire and killed his best friend." "Yes." Erik was quiet for a long time. The city glittered outside the window. The stone pulsed in his chest. The voices sang. "I need to think," he said finally. "Of course." Doom moved toward the door. "I will be in the guest quarters for 3 days. If you decide to pursue the extraction, send word. If not, we never had this conversation." "Precisely." Doom paused at the threshold. "Erik." "Yes." "The question Charles asked in his letter, the one you never answered. When you have won everything you wanted to win, when there is nothing left to fight and no one left to fear, what will you do with the peace you forced into existence?" Erik said nothing. "The answer is not in the stone," Doom said. "The answer is not in the power or the legacy or the empire you have built. The answer is in you, in the man you choose to be when the fighting is done. And that man—" Doom paused. His scars caught the light, the map of a life that had been rebuilt from ruin, that had become something more than the original design. "That man is the only legacy worth leaving." He left. Erik stood alone in the study that had been Charles's, and the silence that followed was the loudest sound he had ever heard. Meanwhile, in the tunnels beneath the city, Ramai stood in the chamber where the cell leaders had gathered 2 weeks earlier. He was not alone this time. 6 others were with him, the ones who would be at the center of what was coming. They had come through the tunnels again, taking the same paths, following the same routes. The consistency was important. The ritual was important. The things that mattered were the things that did not change. "Tomorrow night," Ramai said. "The timing's been confirmed. The resources are in position. The people know what to do." No one spoke. They had heard this before, or versions of it, and they understood what it meant. The fire was coming. The ember was ready to catch. "I can't tell you everything about what's gonna happen," Ramai continued. "Not because I don't trust you, because the less you know, the safer you are. The people who need to know, the people who don't. They just do their part. That's how this works. That's how it's always worked." He looked around the circle, the faces of people he had come to know over 5 years of patient work, people he trusted, people who believed in what they were doing. He thought about Kurt, not the betrayal, but the faith that had driven it. Kurt had believed in what he was doing with the same uncomplicated certainty that these people believed in theirs. The difference was direction, not intensity. The difference was the story they were each trying to tell. "Whatever happens," Ramai said, "remember why we're here. Not to win, not to destroy Magneto's empire, not to prove anything. We're here because somewhere, somehow, someone needs to know that another way was possible, that the ember was always burning, that the story didn't end when Day said it ended." He paused. The silence in the chamber was absolute, the silence of people who understood exactly what they were being asked to do and were choosing to do it anyway. "Tomorrow night," he said again. "Be ready." They nodded. They dispersed. The chamber was empty. Ramai stayed. He thought about Erik Lehnsherr, the man who had killed Charles and built an empire and bonded with a cosmic artifact in a desperate attempt to hold everything together. He thought about the question Charles had asked and Erik had never answered. What would Erik do with the peace he forced into existence? He thought about the fire that was coming, not the metaphorical fire of the remnant's resistance, but something literal, something structural, something that would change everything if it worked and destroy everything if it didn't. He thought about the ember catching finally, after years of waiting, and he walked out of the chamber into the darkness, toward whatever came next. Chapter 25, The End of the Beginning. The end of the beginning. This is where the story stops. Erik Lehnsherr stood in his study, in the room that was Charles's, in the world he built with his hands and his will, and the absolute refusal to accept the terms that history had written for him. The stone pulsed in his chest, billions of voices, billions of minds, the accumulated weight of existence pressing against his awareness like an ocean against a cliff. 3 days. Doom was waiting in the guest quarters. 3 days to decide whether to pursue the extraction, to give up the power the stone had given him, to return to being what he was before, to face the question that had haunted him since the night he killed Charles, or to continue, to deepen the bond, to become something that was no longer Erik Lehnsherr and might never have been. The choice was his. It had always been his. That was the irony, the thing that Charles had tried to tell him in the letter, the thing Erik had been avoiding for years. The power was not the answer. The power was never the answer. The answer was something else, something he could feel but not name, something that lived in the space between the voices in his head and the light from the stone in his chest. And somewhere in the tunnels beneath the city, Remy LeBeau was preparing to light a fire that would change everything. The remnant was moving. The ember was catching. The story was not over, it was just beginning in the way that all stories begin. Quietly, invisibly, in the hearts of people who refused to accept the world as it was and kept working, kept waiting, kept believing that someday it would change. Erik did not know about the fire. The stone showed him the souls of everyone on Earth, but it did not show him their intentions, their plans, their private hopes and fears. He felt the remnant as a presence, the quiet resistance, the patient network, the ember that burned in the darkness, but he did not know what it was preparing to become. He would find out eventually. He always found out eventually, but not yet, not yet. Erik walked to the window, pressed his hand against the glass. His reflection stared back, older than he remembered, harder than he wanted to be, changed in ways he was only beginning to understand. He thought about Charles, about the letter, about the question that had never been answered. What will you do with the piece you forced into existence? He did not know. He was not sure he would ever know. But he was standing at the window, in the study that had been Charles's, in the world he had built, and for the first time in years he was thinking about what came after. The stone pulsed. The voices sang. And in the city below, in the tunnels beneath the streets, in the hearts of people who were preparing to burn for something they believed in, the ember caught. The epilogue. A safe house in what used to be Berlin, a letter arrived. It was not a letter in the traditional sense, not paper, not handwriting, not any of the forms that letters had taken for centuries. It was a message, encoded in a frequency that only certain devices could receive, carrying words that had been written by someone who was already gone by the time the message arrived. The message said, "The fire is lit. The ember has caught. What comes next is up to you." Remy read the message, stood, walked to the window. The city glittered, the same city it had always been, the same streets, the same buildings, the same world that belonged to Magneto and did not know what was coming. But the ember was burning now. The fire was lit. And whatever came next, whatever the fire became, whatever it destroyed or rebuilt or transformed, would be decided not by Magneto's power or the stone's influence or any of the forces that had shaped the world for the past decade. It would be decided by the people who had been building toward this moment for years, by the ones who had remembered that another way was possible, by the ones who had chosen to believe in the ember even when the ember was too small to see. Remy pressed his hand against the glass. His reflection stared back, silver-haired, tired, carrying the weight of everything he had built and everything he was about to lose. He smiled. Then he turned off the light and walked into the darkness, toward the fire. To be continued.